It's My Nerd World, a space opera podcast, a show, dare I say, an epic, devoted to the greatest subgenre in the history of content creation. Okay, that's a bit of a stretch. I just happen to love space operas. On the show this week, talk a little bit about the series on HBO Max. It originally aired on, I believe, CNN and on HBO. It's an HBO production. I mean, it's a CNN production. But it basically goes through all the different eras of filmmaking and movies. And watching it from the very beginning and going through the golden age, something kind of stuck out as it relates to science fiction and space opera. So I want to share that with you. We're going to continue our brief history of the genre of space opera. And what I'm finding out is that opinions about the genre and what it means are vastly different depending on what article and who you're speaking to. So we have another article we'll share this week. Our rewatch, kind of an oddball one that I wasn't anticipating talking about, but my son suggested we watch this movie. I'm on vacation this week, and half the family's out of town, and I said, all right, we can sit down and watch it. And it didn't even occur to me that I was watching a space opera, and a damn good space opera at that. This week, our rewatch is going to be Titan AE. Plus, we do have some listener feedback from those who have emailed the TalkShowNerd at gmail.com, so we'll get to that as well. The show is obviously brought to you by My Nerd World and MyNerdWorld.net, where you can find out all things My Nerd World podcasts and the EMBARK space opera novels. And this week's show is also brought to you by Zone. A lot of people have reached out after last week's show, so here's the details on what Zone is. 1 million users united with one mission, and that is to take back social media. Now, with your help, Zone will take billions from today's social media giants and then give it back to you, the user. Now, I'm concerned about the increasing amount of censorship that's been coming from social media companies, and I use a lot of social media. At the My Nerd World, at Jon Justice on Twitter. You can find those on Instagram and Facebook as well. But I'm a part of Zone now. It's a brand new social media outlet that's launching very soon, and it really is revolutionary. It's a better all-in-one social media alternative, and this eliminates the need for the social media giants. With one profile, you are able to create multiple zones using different avatars that suit your own online persona needs. You can become a Zone ambassador. It's free for a limited time, and you're going to get increased influence as well as a variety of other advantages. Plus, Zone is all user-owned, completely user-owned. Anyone can invest to own more of the Zone platform, and at very little cost. Don't wait, though. Zones claimed first are going to have more influence. So, Zone launches soon. Join me and claim your Zone today, and here is the website. It's ourzone.zone. 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 Again, ourzone.zone.
My Nerd World.
It is My Nerd World, a space opera podcast, and I am your host, Jon Justice. Glad you are with the show again this week. It really does mean a lot. You can always email me, talkshownerd at gmail.com, or go on by the website, mynerdworld.net, mynerdworld.net, where you can find out all things about this show, the Star Wars podcast, the Depeche Mode podcast, and the science fiction space opera series, EMBARK. 3 books in, 4th book on the way, 5th book currently being written. And again, welcome to the show. I'm glad you're with me again this week. Like I stated last week, and for those that may have missed last week's initial episode and the preview pod, which you can definitely go and check out, I had initially thought about doing a self-publication podcast for my becoming an author, having written my 3 stories, EMBARK: The Great Evacuation, EMBARK: Treasure in Darkness, and EMBARK: The Vanishing War, and then coming very soon, Gone Corbin and the Asteroid of Misfortune, and then the kickoff of a new trilogy in EMBARK Book 5. But, as I mentioned last week, it wasn't quite working out the way that I wanted it to for a self-publishing podcast, and so I decided to first look to see if there were any space opera podcasts, and I found out there's not. there's a lot of podcasts dedicated to science fiction and talking with different science fiction content creators and authors and filmmakers, but nothing devoted specifically to the space opera genre. And it's my favorite genre. And even without even me thinking about it, because of my love of Star Wars and what has grown out of that, space opera and everything that falls under that particular umbrella is by far the most compelling subgenre of science fiction, on top of me being a massive sci-fi fan. So I decided to go ahead and start a space opera podcast where we would talk a bit about the genre. We would cover a new film or a new book release. We will be doing interviews sometime in the near future when things on the author side of my life slow down, because I'm juggling doing multiple shows, the full-time radio host job, along with writing these books. And so when I have some time to schedule in and start talking to some space opera authors and content creators, you will obviously hear that right here on a space opera podcast. This week, I wanted to continue with something that we started last week, and that is going over a bit of the history of the genre. I found a brand new article. Well, actually, it's not a brand new article. It's a new article to me. This article was actually written on the cusp of The Last Jedi coming out, which is really interesting from the standpoint of what the writer from Film School Rejects, where I found the article, some of the jabs that they take at Star Wars in a pre-Last Jedi world before that controversy erupted. So from that aspect, it's a pretty interesting read. But beyond that, it's also a really interesting read from the space opera perspective. We covered an article last week, and there's kind of a big gap between what was talked about last week in terms of the history of the genre and what this particular writer from Film School Rejects has to say about it. Before I get to that, though, and we talk a bit about the rewatch of Titan AE, a fantastic film, not without its flaws and changes if I had my hands on it, but a really enjoyable space opera, and one that probably a lot of you listening to the show haven't seen before. Before we get to that, though, I want to talk a little bit about the series movies on HBO Max. Now, this is an incredibly well-produced series that goes through all of the different ages of Hollywood filmmaking. And I've seen sort of the latter half of these episodes, but not in their entirety. And recently, having downloaded the HBO Max app, I was really excited to see that the series was on HBO Max. And so this afternoon, as I was prepping for this week's show, I decided to sit down and put on the very first episode, which is just titled The Golden Age. And it is fascinating, especially in and this is as political as I'm going to get, but especially in the environment that we live today, where there is so much commentary on diversity, inclusivity, gender roles in films, and I'll just stop there. It's really interesting to see a real honest take of Hollywood and what was happening back then within Hollywood, and the script writing process and the production process and the directing process that was actually really surprising, given a lot of the controversies that we see today that dominate so much of our conversation around films. More specifically, what I'm driving at is watching this first episode of movies, I suddenly found evidence of kind of what I had expected for a long, long time, and that is movies are way more inclusive than people want to go and let on. Okay, and again, I don't want to get political here. I just want to state something up front. I know there's been a lot of complaints, especially when it comes to the Disney Star Wars era, from a certain segment of the fandom that I don't agree with, who have talked a lot about SJW and things of that nature. Again, without giving an opinion on that, what's really, really fascinating is that you go back and you watch the golden age of cinema and you see the number of women that were actually recognized, and how for a period of time in filmmaking, the cinemas were dominated with female leads, to the point where it was all females on the screen. It's just really, really interesting when you consider some of the arguments that are made today that just do not line up when it comes to what people complain about in modern-day filmmaking and production and casting, and hiring, and you go back and you watch some of these documentaries about early 30s and 40s Hollywood, and you'll find out, wow, either there was a misstep along the way or things are not nearly as bad as what everybody said. Anyways, the other thing that I wanted to mention more specifically to a space opera podcast, because I got way more political than I wanted it to, I just thought it was an interesting observation, is that, boy, a surprising lack of science fiction. Looking back at those 30s and 40s, you've got adventure films in there, but very little big screen science fiction films. And I know when the juxtaposition takes place, we're going to get into that a little bit in this article here from Film School Rejects. I know personally when that change began to happen, but seeing all of the major motion pictures and what people were going to the cinemas, especially during the Great Depression, to see, it is abundantly clear that there was a complete lack of anything science fiction, which is really, really interesting because it's not just science fiction, it's also a bit of fantasy. And even the science fiction that we got leading up to the big one, right, and I'll get to that in a second, was surprisingly sort of downbeat and depressing, and they were allegories to modern societal challenges, as was Star Wars 2, but George was very sort of subversive with all of that. You only find out later on what his influences were, even though you could definitely inject your own perception of what he was trying to say in terms of modern society and the Vietnam War and, to a lesser extent, religion, but I don't want to get into that. However, the larger point I want to make is that George Lucas and Star Wars, when it came around, it really becomes abundantly clear why that film ended up taking off the way that it did, because he just did something that hadn't been done before. You'd seen it in some of the Saturday morning serials, but to take it to the level that George Lucas did in creating this space opera Western set in space that had subtext that was relatable to the average, moviegoer in the in the late 1970s, it really was groundbreaking in what he was attempting to do. And it's just so hard to see that these days because so much has been done already. But if you're like me and you love movies, go check out this series on there, on HBO Max. It really is well done. I'm looking forward to watching more of it this weekend. All right, so let's go ahead and transition from that to this week's topic for the show, if you will, beyond our rewatch, and that is continuing to look at the history of the genre of space opera. I have an article here from Carrie and Fisher from Film School Rejects. Adventure awaits, a brief history of space opera. As the galaxy celebrates The Last Jedi, as I said, this is when it came out, we celebrate the unappreciated subgenre of science fiction that paved the way for our favorite space adventures, right? Now, he starts this off talking about how everybody is celebrating The Last Jedi coming out. And again, what's really funny about this is the fact that, this is pre all the controversy around it, because there's some stabs that he takes at Star Wars later on in the article. But he basically starts off and says that it's time for reflection, right? I want to look at the once maligned strand of space romp that Star Wars is very much a product of, and that is the space opera. What is it, though? Right? Very similar to the article that we had on last week's show. Given the space opera has a history of being scorned by critics and dismissed by academics and sci-fi scholars alike, only a few commentators have tried to define the subgenre. The term was originally coined back in 1941 by influential critic and fanzine trendsetter Bob Tucker, who, despite dedicating his life to the study of science fiction, had no kind words to say about the stories that he defined as space operas. And he said here, and I do that thing with my fingers, in these hectic days of phrase coining, we offer one. Westerns are called horse operas. The morning housewife tearjerkers are called soap operas. For the hacking, grinding, stinking, outworn spaceship yarn, or world-saving for that matter, we offer space opera. Space opera was unwanted, according to the writer, and not welcomed by the more sophisticated aficionados of sci-fi, but they just had to learn to live with it. Since Tucker's definition, however, other experts have adopted a more level-headed, objective, and even appreciative approach when describing these interstellar pulp stories. In her essay, Not Just Cosmic Skullduggery, a partial reconsideration of space opera. Boy, is that pinkies up. Patricia Monk, even her name is Pinky's Up. I'm Patricia Monk. I have written an article, not just cosmic skullduggery, but a partial reconsideration of space opera. Okay, that was awful. I apologize. Patricia Monk says this. She characterized space operas as romantic, action-oriented, imaginative, circumscribed, optimistic, socially naive. Regardless of the myriad of meanings, various writers have applied to space operas throughout the years. Most have acknowledged common themes in the majority of the stories, such as the existence of alien life forms and conflicts taking place in outer space. Now, the space opera genre skyrocketed in the latter part of the decade due to the emergence of sci-fi magazines like Amazing Stories and Weird Tales. E. Smith's 1928 The Skylark of Space is widely considered the first true space opera by traditional standards, and the author is often hailed as the subgenre's forefather. Now, in the 1930s, were the golden age for space opera across a variety of mediums. Literature started to blend narratives from westerns, detective, war, and adventure fiction with tales of interstellar voyages to create a popular new era in sci-fi storytelling. And what he points to here, though, are writers, and again, there is a lack of film here. In addition to stories appearing in novels and pulp magazines, comic strips, television, and some film, they also started to embrace space opera in the late 1920s and into the following decade. The Buck Rogers character made his comics debut in 1929. Then in 1933, he made his screen debut in the 10-minute film Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, an interplanetary battle with the Tiger Men of Mars. That's a title that actually takes longer to say than it does to go and watch the film, considering it was only 10 minutes long. Hence, back to my point, there weren't a lot of science fiction fantasy films back in those days. Science fiction, yes. Let me rephrase it. There was some science fiction. Depending on what you classify like a film like, certainly the Universal monster films or King Kong. But, okay, back to the article. In 1936, the Flash Gordon serial, based on Alex Raymond's popular 1934 comic series of the same name, was adapted by Universal to become one of the highest-grossing films of that year. A second serial, Flash Gordon's Trip to Mars, followed in 1938. And Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe completed a trilogy back in 1940. The subgenre's transition into visual media soared at the tail end of the 1940s and into the 50s. Shows like Captain Video and his Video Rangers, Tom Corbett, Space Cadet, and Space Patrol took television into space, while characters like Captain Comet, and Adam Strange graced the panels of DC titles. But it wasn't until the 1960s that space opera truly blossomed on the small screen. In 1965, Lost in Space made its debut and even got the attention of NASA, who saw the show as an opportunity to promote their space program at the time. Another popular sci-fi show, with a strong space opera flavor to emerge during the swinging decade, sought to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Of course, I'm talking about Star Wars. That was a joke. I'm talking about Star Trek. I'm going to jump ahead, too, because friend of the show, Edwin, and his Lowdown show, which you should check out on YouTube. Just search for the L-O-Down Show, the Lowdown Show. Did a recent interview with him about the third book in the EMBARK series, and really had a great time, and that's available on the podcast page at mynerdworld.net. Star Trek differed from the fare that came before, as it coupled the action-oriented characteristics that were commonplace within the genre with philosophical, thought-provoking themes. For a brand of science fiction that was introduced to pop culture discourse as hacky, grinding, stinking, outworn spaceship yarn, Star Trek proved that this type of accessible entertainment could contain substance as well as pure entertainment. I'm going to stop here briefly. I want to mention something, too. Another documentary that I found on HBO Max. It's called Trek Nation. And what Trek Nation is about, it's about Gene Roddenberry's son. His son actually created this documentary where he basically goes and interviews people who were a part of not only the original Star Trek television show, but also the films, to find out more about his father, who died in the 90s. It turns out that Gene Roddenberry's son and Gene Roddenberry were not all that close. And so he wanted to, as his son, find out more about his dad posthumously. So he created this documentary, and it really is a fascinating watch. I'm definitely a Star Wars person before I'm a Star Trek person. I don't even think I've seen all of the original Star Trek television shows. I may have when I was a kid and I don't remember, but it's not anything that I return to. I'm more of sort of a modern day Star Trek. I love Wrath of Khan. I think that's a fantastic film. I think Voyage Home is good. I'm a big fan of the three more recent J.J. Abrams and Star Trek Beyond films, but I'm not a Trekkie by any stretch of the imagination. However, that documentary was really, really insightful and some interesting and controversial insights into Gene Roddenberry that I wasn't aware of. I kind of had a Me Too thing going on that gets talked about in the documentary, but then gets kind of glazed over. So definitely go and check that out, especially if you're a Trekkie. In the Cambridge Companion to Science Fiction, geez, talk about pinkies up on that one. It's the Cambridge Companion to Science Fiction. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're all Star Trek fans here. They note the Star Trek was the first on-screen space opera successfully to combine the classic pulp adventure elements of the Rewatchian themes. The Rewatchian space opera is distinguished by sophisticated characteristics, which often entail romance subplots and solar systems governed by their own political establishments. Hey, I hadn't really heard that before, but EMBARK is kind of Rewatchian to a certain extent. Although I bet mine has way less sophistication when it comes to stuff that blows up. That would be my guess. There is a romantic subplot, and there are essentially solar systems governed by at least attempts for their own political establishment. So, hey, look at that. Can I be pinky stuff? No, the EMBARK series is ruined. Sorry. In these stories, alien life forms tend to be three-dimensional and driven by their own personal motives. No aliens in my book, such as greed and thievery, etc. In 1977, Star Wars came along and changed the game completely, inspiring a new era of space yarns as a result. These included imitators like The Black Hole, Star Crash, Battle Beyond the Stars, The Last Starfighter, and the television series Battlestar Galactica, which Lucas tried to sue for plagiarizing his ideas. I'd never heard that before. In the 2000s, shows like Battlestar Galactica Reboot and Firefly kept quality space operas alive, with George Lucas trying to destroy all goodwill he'd built with his original Star Wars trilogy with his prequel trilogy. Thankfully, the Star Wars universe was salvaged by the Clone Wars. That's the dig that I was talking about. And can I just tell you, I'm so sick and tired of hearing this nonsense. This is what I'm going to be focusing on this weekend's Star Wars podcast, if you want to go and check it out. Plus, I'll have the winners of the EMBARK giveaway this week on Saturday's show, depending on when you're listening to this. This will be Saturday the 29th. Look, and again, art is subjective, and everybody is entitled to their opinion. But even today, I was out returning a power vacuum because the wife gave me homework to go and clean the carpets in the house while they were in California and I'm on vacation. And I was listening to the Star Wars Report where they had an interview with the guy, and his name escapes me. But he's written the secret history of Star Wars or whatever. It was a really fascinating listen, but again, it's these definitives that some of these Star Wars fans make of not providing the "in my opinion," and they make these blanket sort of statements like this one here. George Lucas tried to destroy all goodwill he'd built in his original Star Wars trilogy. My gosh, we're so spoiled. And that's what's kind of fun about doing the Space Opera podcast, because I can talk about these other science fiction films that fall into this genre that were really and truly inspired by Star Wars but didn't become nearly as popular. There's a reason for that, because they're not as good even though I enjoy them. Let me put it this way. If the child who saw the original trilogy, that was me, back in the 80s, was given the next year The Phantom Menace, or The Force Awakens, or The Last Jedi, or The Rise of Skywalker, or Solo, or Rogue One, or Attack of the Clones, or Revenge of the Sith to watch, if we were given that follow-up movie to the original trilogy, do you not think that our little child minds would have been blown away? Do you really think we would have been sitting around complaining the way that a majority of the fandom does now? It's like, man, stop being so spoiled. Even on their worst days of Star Wars films, it's better than a vast majority of the science fiction that we get that I also like. Okay. That's what I'll be doing on the Star Wars show this week if you want to go check it out. All right, the article wraps up on this. These days, space operas are bigger than ever. For all the hacking, grinding, stinking, outworn space yarns, it's the third time you use that quote, they are. Space operas have a way of stealing our hearts and imaginations time after time, and they have done for well over a century. Look, all in all, not a bad piece. I just thought it was really interesting how there's quite a few different quotes from different individuals who this particular writer is deriving the origin of space opera from. I actually think that his origin point for space opera in this article was completely different than the one that I had gone and read last week. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com is the email address. And, of course, you can go to mynerdworld.net. As we move on to the rewatch portion of the show, I want to remind you, if you want to support the show, the way to do that is picking up your preferred copy, whether ebook, paperback, or audiobook, of the EMBARK trilogy, available at Amazon.com. Or if you prefer, just go to mynerdworld.net and click the link right there on the homepage. More details on that coming up in just a little bit.
My Nerd World.
So something really funny happened and interesting, at least in my world, when my 18-year-old son Logan suggested we watch Titan AE. This is a movie that I've had on DVD for as long as I can remember. I don't recall being like a massive fan of the film. I just recall enjoying it, and again, having options when it comes to the science fiction that I like to watch. I remember watching it with him as a kid. I may have gone to see it in the theater. One thing that really stuck out upon rewatching it was, one, it's a space opera, and I hadn't really considered that. Two, I think the film inadvertently ended up influencing me in ways that I didn't even understand, because I'm watching this movie that I have probably not watched in at least a decade, if not more. And I'm watching this going, oh my gosh, I've got elements in here that are oddly similar to EMBARK, and I didn't even think of this film when writing any of these stories. And again, it might be partly because Titan AE did borrow from a lot of other films as well. So let's get into it. I found an article here, and it really breaks down a lot of how I feel, and it's kind of the way that I want to do things on the show, share with you other people's opinions, and then add my own as we go along the way. This article comes from Polygon, and it is titled, "The Notorious Animated Film Titan AE Wasn't Supposed to Be Animated. The last film by Fox Animation renders sci-fi tropes with spectacular art." This was actually written earlier. This article was written earlier this year. And what's really fascinating about it to me is that while I'm watching it last night with Logan, suddenly realized that this would have made an amazing live-action film, and it turns out that that's actually what it was supposed to be. So it goes like this. Your favorite childhood movie might have been a total box office dud. The animated movies that defined our late 90s and early 2000s are beloved by a generation that grew up watching them on VHS. But many of these nostalgic favorites were critical failures, box office disappointments, or both. What went wrong along the way, and why did they gain such love after the fact? And this is where we get into Titan AE. Like so many other studios in the 1990s, 20th Century Fox wanted in on the box office gold rush around the Disney Renaissance. Unfortunately, the studio started bringing feature animation to the theaters too late, right at the point where Disney itself was facing diminishing returns from its animated musicals. So after distributing a few animated films produced by outside studios, Fox partnered with former Disney animators Don Bluth and Gary Goldman. Back in the mid-1980s, Bluth and Goldman's Sullivan Bluth Studios had given Disney a run for its money with movies like An American Tail and The Land Before Time. While Fox's animation's first theatrical release, Anastasia, paralleled the Disney formula with its big show-stopping musical numbers and coming-of-age stories centered around a plucky heroine, its next film, the hard sci-fi action story Titan AE, spun in the complete opposite direction. Just a few weeks after the film hit theaters to middling reviews and poor box office returns, Fox Animation shuttered its operations. And yet, while Titan AE was much maligned for leaning too hard on overused science fiction tropes, it was the first taste of grandiose space adventure for younger audiences, and it earned a special place in a lot of childhood memories. Now, it was released back on June 16th of 2000, had a projected budget between 75 and 90 million, only brought in $36.8 million. The Rotten Tomatoes score was 51%. I'm going to make one little argument here. This is not a hard sci-fi action story. Whoever wrote the article at Polygon has their definition of hard science wrong. Look, hard sci-fi, as somebody who writes in a space opera science fiction genre for my EMBARK novels, I know that hard sci-fi is very specific. And when we talk hard sci-fi, we're talking films like The Martian and books like The Martian. There's aliens in the story. I don't necessarily think you can do hard sci-fi and aliens. And even if you could, I still think there's too many liberties that are taken with this particular piece of science fiction space opera content to classify it as hard sci-fi. That's just my own opinion. There might be differences of opinion when it comes to hard sci-fi on the big screen versus in a book. So if this whole time you've been scratching your head going, John, I hear you talking about Titan AE, but what is it about? Well, I have an answer for you. In the distant future, Earth has been destroyed by a mysterious alien race called the Dredge. And humans are dispersed across the galaxy. The Dredge. My bad. The Dredge. I just watched it. You think I should have known that. D-R-E-J. The Dredge. Salvage worker Kale, played by Matt Damon's voice, learns from spaceship pilot Corso, played by Bill Pullman's voice, that the ring Kale inherited from his late father reveals the location of a mysterious project designed to save humanity. Kale joins Corso and his team to find Project Titan, and the Dredge hot on their tail. A little backstory. Here's the thing about Titan AE. It wasn't supposed to be an animated movie, let alone an animated Don Bluth movie. While floating around development at 20th Century Fox, the film was originally conceived as a live-action feature. That would have been rad, and they should still do it. It never took off, though. According to Gary Goldman in an interview with Animation World, Fox filmed entertainment chairman and CEO Bill Mechanic thought the film might look good in CG. After finishing up work on the direct-to-video Anastasia spin-off Bartok the Magnificent, the burgeoning Fox Animation department had no current project in the works, so Titan AE landed in its hands. A screenwriter, John August, came on board the project in '98, hired to polish the dialogue. He ended up sticking around for a few weeks longer to work on the story. Though the project had already transitioned to an animated feature, he says the studio was still trying to figure out what type of animation it would be. Even over the 4 to 6 weeks that I was on board the project, we went from being all traditional animation to completely CG, sort of like Ice Age animation, to the hybrid that it became, August told Polygon in a recent interview. Bluth and Goldman had yet to come on the project at that point. August can't recall the director on board at the time, but he says that he met with the Ice Age director Chris Wedge to discuss the movie. The development process felt more like he was working on a live-action project than an animated one, particularly because the studio had no idea how the final film would look. While animated features tend to have a lot of back and forth between screenwriters and storyboarders, live-action movies tend to be more linear. Write the script, shoot a scene, edit the movie. Goldman and Bluth joined the project sometime after August departed. Josh Whedon finalized the script even further, and neither Goldman nor Bluth had ever worked on a science fiction movie before, but they took on the project regardless. The studio finally solidified the movie's animation style would be a hybrid of CGI and traditional animation. With directors on board, a look set, and the script finalized, Titan AE was ready to take flight. And I will say that I really enjoy, and they get into it a bit here, but I wanted to add my 2 cents. I really do enjoy the look of this film and the transition that they do between CGI and traditional animation. If you watch the Genndy Tartakovsky Clone Wars series that set the stage for the Clone Wars animated series that we got 7 seasons of, there was a 2D animated, basically it was a full 2 hours. They were shorts. Called Clone Wars. They're not available right now, but you can go and find them on YouTube. But they did a bit of a hybrid 2D animation and CGI mixed in, as did Futurama. And I really think Titan AE was one of the first to go and sort of pave the way for that type of combination in animation, even though it quickly faded away and we either were left with traditional 2D or CG. It does work and play very well in Titan AE, in my opinion. So now we get to what went wrong. Unfortunately, Fox Animation went through a massive downsizing in 1999 with more than 300 staff members laid off. The entire studio shuttered in 2000, just a few weeks after Titan AE came out. I actually think there's another very big reason that's not mentioned in the article of why this movie was not successful. And how, if they made one change, this movie could become a cult classic upon perhaps like a re-release anniversary Blu-ray edition, and I'll explain in a moment. I think it's going to be pretty obvious for those of you that have actually seen this film what I'm going to be referring to. Let's see here. The movie was finished at a handful of other studios, including Blue Sky Studios, which went on to make Ice Age 2 years down the line. Because Fox Animation was basically running on a skeleton crew during post-production, Bluth said at a 2010 Animation Nation special event that much of the film's promotion and distribution was halted. Even without production woes, Titan AE is a tricky movie to love. In previous iterations of this series, we've looked at the split in the genre in this era of animation, with some films leaning sharply in the comedic direction while others delving into sci-fi and action. Titan AE is firmly in the latter category. I tend to agree with this, even more so than Treasure Planet or The Iron Giant. It's dark, it's gritty, and the directors take the story very seriously. A Titan AE is a hard science fiction movie, again I disagree, using animation as a medium rather than a genre. While that doesn't necessarily spell box office doom, the American mindset, and to this day, associates Western animation with a family-friendly tone and story. I'd say it's not a mother-friendly movie, although we haven't left mothers and children out, Goldman told the Animation World magazine in 2000. There is some swearing, some sexual innuendo, it's intense, there's a lot of violence. I don't think anybody underage should see this film. Yeah, and I disagree with that. There is an adult tone to it. There's a couple of moments between the two sort of dual protagonists in the voice characters of Matt Damon and Drew Barrymore. But I actually appreciate that about the film, and it really isn't anything different than, say, you like getting in Solo, the live-action film. So, again, in retrospect, I don't know when that comment was made, but I think it might have been a bit misguided, because it is a bit adult, but not that adult, for crying out loud. Within 3 years between Anastasia and Titan AE, audience tastes shifted. Disney began to rethink its own formula, and other studios took a crack at it too. Titan AE swung too hard in the opposite direction, with the very specific goal of being edgy and cool enough to target 12 and 17-year-old boys. That unfortunately jarred too sharply with audience expectations, even as audiences tried to figure out what they wanted next. Yeah, and that part of it I can't agree with. It does not fit into the traditional animated style of movie that we were getting at the time, coming from specifically Disney or what other Fox movies they'd done, right? Now, why we love it today, the article goes on to say. Titan AE came out to mixed reception with critics, who called it a hodgepodge of other science fiction movies, but one response was near universal. It looked great. You know, and again, that hodgepodge of other science fiction movies, man, you could do that. And maybe I take that a bit personally, because I consider especially book 1 in my EMBARK series to be a bit of an homage to the stories that I grew up on. So while I tried to include some things that were new, there's a lot of tropes and especially the lived-in universe that I wanted to create that was very much, again, sort of an homage, a tribute to what came before it. And so watching Titan AE the other night, even before I read this article, I didn't even once think that it was stealing from other people. I thought there were some really imaginative set pieces. And they actually get into that. It looks so good, it's easy to wonder why more science fiction isn't animated. Titan AE sticks to a tried and true expectation of how we imagine humanity will take to the stars, the locations, especially the space stations, like the junkyard where Kale works at the beginning of the movie, and New Bangkok, where dispersed human drifters have built a colony, feel lifted from media like Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, and Babylon 5, but instead of being rendered with clunky set pieces and special effects that don't hold up after 20 years, Titan AE's animation still seems fresh, and the planets, ships, and space scenes look dynamic and captivating. 100% true. One of the most breathtaking moments of the movie happens when Kale and pilot Akima navigate through a planet's icy rings. Corso and his team are on their tail. It's a tense, tight chase scene, and Akima steers the ship through the floating blocks of ice and each ship's reflection confuses the other. It never would have looked as good in live action. The only CG of the movie that does sharply seem out of place are the dredge, the aliens bent on exterminating humans. But because they're beings made of pure energy, designed to be mechanical in lifeless compared to organic humans, their jarring designs work with the overall thread of the movie. And as they want to wipe out humanity. And that's actually totally true, too. And I disagree with the inability to make that ice scene towards the end of the film good in live action. They could totally make that great in live action. And when was this article written again? I think it was actually... No, that was this year. This was the one that was... Okay, whatever. I got a problem with Film School Rejects. Kieran, what's his Yahoo's name again? Oh, no, that was the other article. This is from Polygon.com. I got a problem with Polygon.com. Maybe this article is older. Anyways, a lot of the alien species and planets look on par for Bluth and Goldman's previous animated films. Kale and the team land on a mysterious planet where the alien creature resemble giant bats, almost plucked right out of the duo's 1982 movie, The Secret of Nim, also a fantastic animated film. Most of Titan AE's 94-minute runtime is just the characters getting from one place to another, showing off spectacular set pieces, like a planet covered in a rusty red liquid with large hydrogen trees made up of orbs that float and later explode. The plot isn't particularly groundbreaking, and the characters aren't particularly original, but while they're a bit cliche for science fiction, they are striking when it comes to mainstream Western animation, following more adult characters and dealing with the possible end of humanity as mankind struggles to find its way in a vast expanse of outer space is a far cry from the usual Disney musicals, centered on teenagers journeying towards self-acceptance and romance. Certainly among the biggest critiques of Titan AE was the fact that many of the plot points, story elements, and characters seem lifted from science fiction staples like Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica. Again, I didn't feel that way at all. But Titan AE was the first to encounter with the genre for a lot of kids. The first taste of spaceship chase sequences, the destruction of planet Earth, and humanity venturing into the great beyond. The tropes don't play out as cliche for young viewers experiencing them for the first time. Instead, they are fantastical, daring, and cool. The exact takeaway that Fox Animation aimed for back when the movie was in development. It just took a little extra time and the studio folding for that to stick. Look, I will recommend films on this podcast. I don't normally do that in my other shows because I don't like recommending things because stuff's subjective, but I think you're grown-ups, you could figure it out on your own whether or not you like it. I really enjoy this film. Having watched it again, it's probably going to be a film that I want to revisit. And interestingly enough, didn't feel the need to get the Blu-ray. And let me explain this to you really quick before I give my biggest complaint of the film and why it has not captured a wider audience and even grown in time. Because there's one particular thing that needs to change in that movie for it to become a quintessential cult classic, because I think it has the potential. However, let me say this really quick about physical media. There was a moment in the early 2000s, 90s into 2000s, when we were getting DVDs for the first time. Where you can still watch those DVDs today on modern HD televisions, and they look okay. They don't have the clean, pristine look that a lot of Blu-rays obviously have, but they still look really good. There was a transition later into the early 2000s, around 2010, 2011, when the process at which studios ended up transferring the film to the disc, and I think it has a lot to do with the digital transfer of it, something got lost there. So now there's a whole batch of DVDs that I cannot watch because the pixelation on it is so bad. And I'll give you a really good example. Actually, a couple of them, and they're both from James Cameron. James Cameron has not released True Lies or The Abyss on Blu-ray. Those are two movies that I have on DVD that I cannot watch on DVD because they are too pixelated and they look like garbage. However, older DVDs still hold up. And I was fully expecting to put in Titan AE the DVD last night because I am so, I don't know if OCD is the right word or what, but I am so particular about how my films look. And I put it in and I was shocked at how good it actually looked. Now, granted, I bet it looks even better in Blu-ray. But at this point, I was so happy with what I was watching in terms of quality, being off a DVD, that I did not have a rampant desire to immediately go to bestbuy.com and see if they put it out on Blu-ray. So it still looks that good on DVD. So you could probably track it down if you wanted to. It is on Amazon Prime and is on some of the streaming services. All right, before we wrap the show up this week, I do want to give you my one chief complaint of Titan AE. And if you've seen the film, I'm going to venture a guess you probably already guessed what it was. And the one thing that they can change, and it stuck out like a sore thumb watching it with Logan, they have too many rock songs in it. For whatever reason, they obviously wanted this film to appeal to that 12 to 17-year-olds. I was working for an alternative rock station around the time when this came out, right? Let me double check the date. Let me see here. Well, yeah, it was 2000. So yes, I just got done. I was just transitioning out of doing rock radio, for crying out loud. The film is filled with like 3 or 4 different obscure alt rock tunes that just do not work anymore. And I'm watching it with Logan, and I said, man, if they would go and replace those segments, and they're mostly montages or action sequences, if they would go and replace those with some type of score that's indicative of the score that's with the film, it would drastically improve that movie. But the songs are so jarring that it doesn't ruin it, but man, it does take you out of it for a moment. That's the one thing. If they would re-release that as a special edition and take out those tracks, because they were specifically written for the movie, but in my opinion, they just don't work. They barely worked when it came out in 2000. I think there's one song in there from Vertical Horizon, if that gives you an idea of when those songs were made. But I was watching it going, oh man, this would do so much better with just a straight-up symphonic score. It doesn't need this alt-rock soundtrack. It's not necessary because there's so many cool visuals in it. The action set pieces are great. The sequences are really, really good. The space flight stuff is fantastic. The art direction is great. The vehicle design is spot on. The only thing that I kind of have an issue with is a bit of the main ship in the film, but even then, it's got a unique vibe to it that really does separate it out from what you're used to seeing traditionally as the hero ship. It's got a bit of a campy sort of Saturday morning Flash Gordon vibe to it, but I think that was the point. But the vast majority of the other vehicles and the locations are just stunning as somebody who's a massive fan of vehicles. So check it out if you haven't. It's worthy of a space opera. And again, going back to the comment I made before and what I'll be talking about on Star Wars this week, we really are as modern day film watchers and sci-fi fans, I think there's a lot of people that are just way too spoiled. It's nice to go back, though, and revisit some of these gems and sort of realize, some of these properties out there that could have made for some really spectacular series if they had just gotten more attention at the time. So I would definitely go and encourage you to watch Titan AE. It's a quick watch. It's only about 90 minutes, but it really, really is. It really, really is enjoyable. And kind of like what I said with Jupiter Ascending, even if you don't like it, you're still going to walk away having had a good time, even though you may not want to go and watch it again. Quick programming note. I'm going to ditch off for now the top 10 Amazon space opera books, only because that top 10 list doesn't change all that often. So I'd rather focus on when there are new releases that I want to go and talk about that I've had the opportunity to read, rather than just randomly throwing out, books that are up on Amazon in the space opera category. But what else would you like to hear, and any comments that you have on the show, email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Again, talkshownerd@gmail.com. That's where you can drop me an email. And again, let me know what you think of the show. Any thoughts or comments, topic ideas as well. I can take those at the website. All right, before we wrap it up, we do have a listener feedback to get to. Jen G, listener of the Star Wars podcast, emailed me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, and says, I agree, John. Opera is emotional, so space opera is not just fantasy in space because it needs an emotional content. And I love space opera. I tend to lean more towards the more emotional ones, like Starship Troopers don't really resonate with me. So ones like Starship Troopers don't really resonate with me. But again, that's just me. One of my favorites not on your list is Serenity. Oh, we're going to get to Serenity. Don't you worry about that. And the short-lived series Firefly. I haven't watched Jupiter Ascending yet, but I'm going to watch it now. I loved the Alien series, so hopefully I'll get to watch Raised by Wolves. A good podcast, John. I like how adaptable you get when the Star Wars universe is kind of slow. And these are two separate podcasts, by the way. This is the Space Opera podcast and the Star Wars podcast. But Jen G, thank you so much for the email. I appreciate it. All right. Before I let you go, gonna pimp my books for just a moment. Before I do that, though, remember, start of the show, I mentioned the all-new social networking platform, and this week's episode is brought to you by Zone. You can get more information about this brand-new social media outlet launching soon. All-in-one social media alternative, ourzone.zone. That's O-U-R zone.zone. Also, as I mentioned earlier, you can support the show by picking up, if you're a reader or you have friends or family that are readers, the EMBARK Science Fiction Space Opera Trilogy written by Jon Justice. Available now in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. Search for Jon, Jon Justice, or go to mynerdworld.net. For those that are unfamiliar, here is a bit about EMBARK Book 1, The Great Evacuation. For Earth, the end is near. Only a reluctant hero and the girl he loves have the power to save humanity's future. It's the not-so-distant future, and car culture is replaced by air and space flight, made possible by two of Earth's largest corporations. Flight mechanic Taft Guardia spends his free time racing through the skies with his three best friends and the girl he longs to be with, headstrong Keitha Morrow. With the planet on the brink of an industrial apocalypse, a powerful and ruthless corporate madman, Sint Argum, moves to exploit the disaster with his covertly created military. When Taft, Keitha, and their friends uncover a shocking secret, Sint Argum will stop at nothing to find them. Time on Earth is running out, but with the help of a ragtag group of young pilots, they'll fight for humanity's future and survival among the stars. Again, mynerdworld.net. You can get more details about all three of the opening trilogy. Book 4 will be coming out in the next few months, and I'm currently in the process of writing Book 5, which I cannot wait to finish. Enjoy the rest of the week. I hope you'll check out a Star Wars podcast dropping on Saturday. I will be announcing the winners of the EMBARK signed book giveaway. If you have not entered yet, you have an opportunity to win a complete set of EMBARK paperbacks signed by yours truly. Also, second, third, and fourth place prizes will win autographed copies of the first edition of the EMBARK Book 1 paperback. Go to mynerdworld.net and click the link on the homepage. You have until midnight tonight, that's Friday, to get yourself registered, and I'll be doing the drawing on tomorrow's show. You do not have to listen to win, and shipping is free. All right, that's it. I got to run. I got to go buy pizza and go watch some TV and some NASCAR racing tonight. Have a fantastic week. I hope that you are healthy. I hope that you are safe, and I'm so glad you checked out the show. Talk to you again next week.
My Nerd World.